Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 3.6, the 24th of April. We left off last week with the Soviets poised to attack the centre of Berlin, whilst the Germans, meanwhile, decided to throw one last roll of the dice by appointing General Weidling as the new commander of the Berlin defence area. The appointment of General Weidling as the new commander gave some hope to Berlin's defenders that all was not lost, and that the defence of the city would now be conducted in a more effective way. But the most immediate and visible impact of Weidling's appointment was the formal transfer of his 56th Panzer Corps to the Berlin garrison, and Weidling immediately began distributing the forces of his Panzer Corps around the city in order to strengthen the most critical defensive positions. To the southwest of Berlin, Weidling deployed his 20th Panzer Grenadier Division, with the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division in reserve, and their task was to bolster the defences along the northern bank of the Teltow canal, which was soon to be assaulted by the 3rd Guards Tank Army from Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front. To the north of Berlin, Weidling deployed his 9th Fallschirmjäger Division, where it fell under the command of the Humboldt-Hain Flak Tower. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Division was ordered to stiffen the defences in the Moabit, Wedding and Gesundbrunnen districts in anticipation of a strike south by the 3rd Shock Army from Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front. And in the south of Berlin, the Panzer Division Müncheberg was assigned to assist with the defence of Tempelhof Airport, whilst the SS Nordland Panzer Grenadier Division was deployed in Neukölln and Kreuzberg. And these newly deployed units hoped to hold the line against the advancing 1st Belarusian Front forces of the 5th Shock Army, the 8th Guards Army, and the 1st Guards Tank Army. To increase the number of fighting troops for the Berlin garrison, most of the remaining government offices and departments were shut down, and their staff were sent into the front line, with even female employees being sent to bolster the defence of the governmental district. Weidling also tried to improve the efficiency of the military command structure by sacking the most incompetent defence sector commanders. And once the worst performers had been removed, Weidling also reduced the overall number of defence sectors so that more troops and territory could be centralised under one single command. But whilst these were the right decisions, they were being made too late in the fighting to have any real impact on the outcome of the battle, because the truth was that the Soviets had such an overwhelming amount of troops, tanks, guns, and planes that it simply didn't matter what improvements the Germans made to their command structure. Their defensive positions were being overrun, their ammunition and fuel supplies were running out, and their most experienced soldiers were being slaughtered, only to be replaced by Hitler Youth boys, policemen, or office clerks. The sensible, humanitarian thing the German leadership could have done was to surrender to the Soviets immediately and declare Berlin an open city, thus sparing the Germans, the Russians, and the people of Berlin from any further unnecessary bloodshed. But as long as Hitler drew breath, the fighting would continue. On the morning of the 24th of April, a key milestone in the Red Army's assault on Berlin was reached, when mechanized units of the 8th Guards Army from the 1st Belarusian Front met the 3rd Guards Tank Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front at Bornsdorf in Treptow. And 2 hours later, infantry from both fronts also met nearby at the Schönefelder Junction near Brusendorf. This link-up in the southeast of Berlin between the mechanized and infantry units from both Soviet fronts formally cut off the German 9th Army from the capital, thus tightening the noose on the Berlin garrison and denying it a potential source of reinforcements. Clearly, this was good news for the Soviets, and it should have led to an outbreak of brotherly celebrations between the two fronts. But of course it did not, because welcome to the dog-eat-dog world of the Red Army, where rivalries are bitterly contested for life. As soon as Marshal Zhukov heard of this link-up, he refused to believe what he was hearing, and he insisted that General Zhukov from the 8th Guards Army send officers to determine which 1st Ukrainian Front forces had reached his lines and what their objectives were. Now it's pretty remarkable that Zhukov didn't know Konev's forces were coming his way, and it shows just how poor the state of communication and cooperation was between the two fronts. Marshal Zhukov clearly resented the thought of Konev playing any meaningful role in the capture of Berlin. Plus, Zhukov was further annoyed because he had intended for his strongest armoured forces to launch their own attack on the Germans from the south of Berlin. With Konev's forces now in the way, this was no longer an option. Zhukov was probably going a little bit overboard here, as the appearance of Konev's tanks didn't seriously complicate his advance into the centre of Berlin. But still, you didn't rise to the top of the Red Army food chain without having a healthy sense of paranoia and distrust of your colleagues. So perhaps Zhukov was right to fear that Konev could still swoop in and capture the Reichstag from under his nose. In any case, the combined Soviet forces of Zhukov and Konev were now in position to launch their assaults on the centre of Berlin. Up until now, the quality of German opposition had been poor, and the outer defence ring had crumbled quickly in the face of the Russian onslaught. But as the Red Army moved closer towards the centre of Berlin, the quality of the German troops facing them increased, as did the quality of the German defensive positions which the Soviets now had to overcome, such as the Teltow canal and the inner defence ring. Therefore, the Russians knew that the cost of breaking into the centre of Berlin would be extremely bloody. To the south of Berlin, Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front had spent the previous day preparing for their assault across the Teltow canal, and by first light on the 24th, they were ready to smash through the German defences along the canal. Shortly after 6 a.m., Konev's artillery unleashed a torrent of shells on the buildings held by the Germans on the northern bank of the canal, whilst waves of dive bombers from the Red Army Air Force also swooped down to target any German defensive positions they could see. As soon as this initial bombardment was over, the Soviet infantry began crossing along the centre of the canal in wooden boats and assault craft, and such was the success of the combined artillery and aerial bombardment that these infantry crossings were largely unopposed. By 7 a.m., the 1st Rifle Battalions established a bridgehead on the northern bank, and by midday the first pontoons had been securely established, enabling Soviet armour to also cross. Once this Soviet armoured vanguard was across, they pushed on through the broken German lines and penetrated 2.5 kilometres into South Berlin by the end of the day. This advance secured the entire southern half of the district of Zehlendorf, and when Hitler Youth Boys and Volkssturm units tried to make a last stand at the Zehlendorf town hall, they were torn to pieces, and the Zehlendorf district mayor hung out a white flag before committing suicide. Konev's left flank, meanwhile, led by the 7th Guards Tank Corps from the 3rd Guards Tank Army, also succeeded in establishing a small bridgehead across the Teltow Canal. But here they faced stubborn opposition from German troops, thus the Soviets struggled to break out from their bridgehead. In response, Konev immediately funneled supporting units from the 4th Guards Tank Army across the canal, who were then able to secure the fragile bridgehead and slowly expand it. As Konev's left flank gradually strengthened their hold on the northern side of the canal, their tank units were able to plough through the Germans and race on towards Stahnsdorf, Wannsee, and Potsdam to the southwest of Berlin. In doing so, they pushed the 20th Panzer Grenadier Division back towards the Wannsee Lake, forcing General Weidling to deploy his reserve 18th Panzer Grenadier Division to the south of the city in order to plug the gap in the German lines. The Teltow Canal had been designated as one of the strongest and most heavily defended German defense positions in the south of Berlin. But in the end, the awesome might of the Soviet bombardment and the speed of their infantry and tanks had made light work of those German defences. And with the successful crossing of the canal, the entire southwest of Berlin lay at the mercy of Konev's First Ukrainian Front. However, just when Konev thought he could advance into Berlin unhindered, he was forced to confront two rather unexpected surprises. Firstly, he was having to dedicate a significant amount of his rearguard forces to the encirclement of the German 9th Army in the Haube area. And secondly, by the late evening of the 24th of April, Konev's left flank also started to feel the first probing attacks from General Wenck's 12th Army, as it thrust towards the towns of Belitz and Treuenbrietzen as part of its rescue mission to save the trapped 9th Army. And if the German 9th and 12th Armies did link up, then this might sever the supply lines of his frontline forces fighting in Berlin. Thus, Konev was forced to redeploy significant amounts of infantry regiments and tank brigades south of Berlin to counter the dual threats of the German 9th and 12th Armies, and make sure they did not meet. Nevertheless, despite these complications, Konev's crossing of the Teltow Canal had been a success, and his forces were now firmly established in the south of Berlin. Meanwhile, to the southeast of the city, Zhukov's forces continued their advance, as on the morning of the 24th, the 9th Rifle Corps from the 5th Shock Army also crossed to the River Spree and advanced towards Treptower Park. General Weidling had anticipated this thrust from Zhukov's forces, and he had assembled a German counter-attacking force at Tempelhof Airport specifically to blunt this Soviet advance. And now that this German force had been refueled and resupplied with fresh ammo, they were ready to launch a blistering counterattack on the 5th Shock Army, threatening Treptower Park. The park had been earmarked as a significant target by the Russians because the northern end of the park touched the inner defense ring. And to underline the importance of capturing Treptower Park, the Soviet 9th Rifle Corps had amassed a mighty force of 16,000 men, 100 guns and mortars, 27 tanks, and 700 supply trucks. The Germans were equally determined to hold the park at all costs, and as soon as the 9th Rifle Corps started ferrying men and equipment across the River Spree towards the park, they were immediately met with a hail of fire from the Nordland Panzer Grenadier Division. The crossings were bloody, but the Soviets were able to establish a foothold in the park. In an effort to dislodge the Soviets, Weidling ordered the Nordland Panzer Grenadier Division to drive back the enemy, and the division launched 6 separate counterattacks over the next 3 hours. The losses were high on both sides, but each German counterattack failed to push back the Soviets, and by the evening, the 9th Rifle Corps had captured the park and taken Treptower Park's S-Bahn station. Zhukov's forces struggled to advance further than this, however, because numerous units were being held up for hours by isolated Volkssturm and SS snipers hidden in the roofs of residential buildings and factories. So in order to root out these snipers, the Soviets turned to an imaginative and destructive solution. Firstly, they called in the Red Army Air Force to fly over any buildings they suspected of harboring snipers, and the planes were ordered to drop small-caliber explosives, such as hand grenades, directly onto the roofs. The goal here was to contain the destruction to just the upper floors of the buildings, rather than knock down the buildings entirely. After all, collapsing buildings would just lead to a mountain of rubble being strewn across the streets, blocking the passage of tanks. Once the aerial sortie was complete, the Russian tanks cautiously advanced, providing cover to groups of 30 or 40 infantry armed with submachine guns. And behind the infantry came groups of shock troops, who were ordered to search the houses for any leftover German troops. If German troops were found, or if the stubborn German snipers continued to fire upon the Russians from the upper floors, then the Soviets switched to their second tactic, which was to douse the building in petrol and set it alight. The Red Army's advance was also frustrated by the fact that even when houses or buildings surrendered by waving a white flag or handkerchief, Soviet troops could still be subjected to continuing fire from the building. This was because there was a huge discrepancy in the willingness to fight amongst the Berlin garrison forces, with Volkssturm units eager to lay down their weapons and save their lives, whilst fanatical Waffen-SS units would rather die than surrender. It's no surprise that the Volkssturm's morale was so fragile, because the Volkssturm units were comprised of elderly men and young boys who should have been nowhere near the front line. The young boys were simply unfit for the insane things they were being forced to do in the defense of the city. For instance, the Berliner Dorothea von Schwanenflügel was out collecting her food rations for the day when she suddenly saw a young boy preparing to fight. As she later recounted, "I went over to him and found a mere child in a uniform many sizes too large for him. He had an anti-tank grenade lying beside him. Tears were running down his face, and he was obviously very frightened of everyone. I very softly asked him what he was doing there. He lost his distrust and told me that he had been ordered to lie in wait here, and when a Soviet tank approached, he was to run under it and explode the grenade. I asked how that would work, but he didn't know. In fact, this frail child didn't even look capable of carrying such a grenade." Whilst the fighting in the south of Berlin was marked by intense street fighting and running battles between German and Russian tanks, the Soviet advance to the northeast and east of Berlin was able to make great progress on the 24th of April. For instance, the 7th Rifle Corps from the 3rd Shock Army advanced through the Prenzlauer Berg district, down Prenzlauer Allee and Greifswalder Straße towards Alexanderplatz. And during this advance, they surprisingly encountered little opposition. Meanwhile, the 26th Guards Rifle Corps and the 32nd Rifle Corps of the 5th Shock Army advanced along Frankfurter Allee, penetrating the inner defense ring with ease. However, whilst these Soviet advances had encountered little in the way of organized resistance as they advanced through the outer line districts, as soon as they reached the eastern perimeter of the central district, the German resistance became more intense. Suddenly, the 26th Guards Rifle Corps and the 32nd Rifle Corps came under direct fire from the Friedrichshain Flak Tower, temporarily halting their advance along Frankfurter Allee. The firing from the Flak Tower didn't just wreak havoc on the Soviets, however, as it also caused huge amounts of destruction to the rows of civilian housing along Frankfurter Allee, with almost every building being systematically destroyed in the bombardment. As the fighting was now entering the most heavily built-up areas of Berlin, it was no surprise that an increasingly high number of Berliners were being caught in the crossfire. And in response, the people of Berlin, deploying their gallows humor, started referring to their city as the Reichsscheiterhaufen, the Reich's funeral pyre. Meanwhile, to the north of the city, the Soviet advance, led by the 12th Guards Rifle Corps from the 3rd Shock Army, made their way through the working-class district of Wedding. During the Weimar years, Wedding had been a communist stronghold, but surprisingly, the Red Army had to fight tooth and nail when moving through the district, and their riflemen particularly struggled when advancing through the maze of high tower blocks and courtyards which crisscrossed the district. Plus, when the Soviets reached the Wedding S-Bahnhof, positioned on the northern edge of the inner defense ring, they encountered fierce resistance from well-dug-in German positions, which temporarily halted their advance, until powerful artillery support was called in to obliterate the defending troops. Just as in the east of the city, as soon as the 12th Guards Rifle Corps' left flank came up against the Humboldt-Hain flak tower, they were stopped dead in their tracks, as the huge concrete monstrosity was able to rain down a wave of shells onto the Soviet infantry. The Russians tried firing their artillery guns at the flak tower, but they were powerless to bring it down. The Soviets considered sending in more infantry on foot to try and assault the flak tower head-on. But this was quickly dismissed due to the presence of railway embankments which formed a dry moat protecting the front of the flak tower, plus the Humboldt-Hain public park behind the flak tower represented an open killing field which exposed any troops trying to attack the tower from the rear to German machine gun fire. As a result, the Soviets couldn't see any way to capture or knock out the Humboldt-Hain flak tower, so they did the smart thing and decided to just contain it and move on. Wolfgang Karol, an infantry NCO on leave in Berlin, had been transferred into an ad hoc unit at the Humboldt-Hain flak tower the previous day. Here he gives his account of the action he saw on the 24th. We first came under fire from the Hertha BSC football ground and then pushed off to Bellermannstrasse, where we took over an apartment block. We had to get the occupants out of the cellars to unlock the apartment doors for us. The other side of the street was already occupied by the Russians, and a brisk exchange of fire was opened up between us. Our lieutenant, who was our combat team leader, was a good comrade. We knew, as well as he did, that this was all 5 minutes to 12, and that the war would be over in a few days. His orders were therefore considerate, and he was careful not to take risks with anyone unless it was necessary. So we pulled out and made for the Humboldt-Hain flak tower. There we were put into reserve and were able to get to know the interior of this vast bunker. We experienced the violent shaking when all 825mm anti-aircraft guns fired a salvo at the Russians, feeding them a violent form of respect. The Russian artillery fire was particularly fierce against the walls of the bunker, since their infantry could not get in. Our brave gunners were being killed mercilessly at their posts, and they were nearly all young flak auxiliaries, 14 to 16-year-olds. These brave youngsters continued to serve their guns fearlessly, and several were felled before our eyes. An assault group was formed from our reserve combat team, including myself. We were ordered to try and get some sweets from the Hildebrandt chocolate factory on Pankstrasse, which was nearby in no man's land. So we put on some large Luftwaffe rucksacks and set off. We arrived without any trouble, but then had to detain a Nazi Party official who tried to prevent us entering at gunpoint. We were able to fill our rucksacks with chocolates and return to the bunker without suffering any casualties. And when we arrived, we were warmly received by our comrades. To the northwest of Berlin, the 47th Army from the First Belarusian Front continued its advance, aiming to fully encircle Berlin from the west. Here, the 60th and 76th Rifle Divisions of the 125th Rifle Corps attacked Spandau, whilst the 175th Rifle Division from the same Rifle Corps continued advancing south in order to launch an assault on the Gatow airfield. And when the Russians reached the Gatow airfield to the west of Berlin, they launched a ferocious attack, and the Volkssturm defenders holding the airfield were decimated. However, the Soviets were prevented from capturing the airfield because German reinforcements were hurriedly thrown into the line. Thus, despite repeated Soviet assaults, the airfield remained in German hands for the time being. The Soviet assault on Spandau was equally savage, and the Russians were only able to break through the German defensive positions by sending in literally hundreds of infantry to swarm the Berlin garrison troops. For example, a French prisoner of war who was imprisoned in Berlin during the battle witnessed a Soviet attack on a German barricade outside the Schultheiss brewery in northern Spandau, and he later recounted what he saw. The roadblock's defenders were bombarded by heavy mortars set up in some ruined houses nearby. Then the Russians set up a 75 or 105mm gun several hundred meters from the barricade. The Russian gunners were completely exposed, and at the cost of several casualties, they succeeded in getting some shots on the target, destroying the barricade and killing a number of Germans. And then the Soviet infantry, about 100 strong, charged in screaming. They quickly swamped the remaining defenders, opened the barrier, and regrouped on the street corner opposite the brewery. German losses were increased by the bitterness of the Soviet soldiers, who seemed to be drugged and who rarely took prisoners. We found numerous German corpses, civilians, and soldiers when we were able to get out of the brewery. Given the high losses the Soviets had suffered in the first day of their assault on Spandau, their commanders decided to pull back their infantry for the night. And whilst their infantry rested, waves of Red Army fighter bombers were sent in to batter the German defences and soften them up for a renewed Soviet assault the next day. Whilst the 47th Army attacked Spandau from the north, the 1st Mechanized Corps and 12th Guards Tank Corps from the 2nd Guards Tank Army launched a separate strike into Spandau from the east, and these armoured units crossed the Jungfernheide Park and reached the Hohenzollern Canal during the afternoon. Using the cover of the woods which lined the northern bank of the canal, they managed to cross undetected. And by nightfall, several combat groups had even reached the edge of the Siemensstadt district. Just to the east, the 3rd Shock Army's 79th Rifle Corps wasn't able to enjoy as much success on the 24th, because whilst they managed to advance through the southern part of Reinickendorf and were able to also reach the banks of the Hohenzollern Canal, they were unable to cross as they faced heavy fire from German troops stationed in the Plötzensee prison and the warehouses dotted along the banks of the Westhafen. So as we can see, by the end of the 24th of April, various Soviet armies are on the move across Berlin. And whilst the progress is painstaking in some areas and remarkably easy in others, the overall picture of the battle is that the Russian advance is continuing without any major hiccups. And some Soviet units, particularly to the northeast and east, had even managed to break through the inner defense ring and reach the perimeter of the central district. As a sign of their increasing confidence regarding the progress of their assault on Berlin, the Soviets even set up their first civil administration in the city on the 24th of April, when they appointed a pro-Soviet German mayor in the locality of Hermsdorf on the northern outskirts of Berlin. For the Germans, the 24th of April is another one of those god-awful days where good news is hard to conjure up. But whilst the Berlin defense plan is buckling, the strong resistance shown by the flak towers combined with the repeated German armoured counterattacks in Treptower Park, have shown that Berlin is not going down without a fight. Also, the Berlin garrison would receive a fresh batch of desperately needed reinforcements on the 24th, as SS Brigadeführer Gustav Krukenberg showed up with a detachment of 350 French SS loyalists. These men were the remnants of the SS Charlemagne division, and once Vichy France had fallen, their unit had been disbanded, as the Nazi regime doubted the continuing loyalty of the Frenchmen. However, when given the option to either perform back-breaking construction work or volunteer for a glorious last-ditch stand in Berlin, 350 of the most hardcore fascists had chosen to fight. Krukenberg's French force had gone through an arduous journey to even reach Berlin, because they had been forced to avoid numerous Soviet patrols whilst having to march most of the way on foot. So when the French SS men reached the Olympiastadion, they collapsed from exhaustion. Luckily for them, however, the men discovered a Luftwaffe supply store, and soon they were drinking a special pilot's cocoa laced with benzodrine. Unsurprisingly, few managed to sleep. Krukenberg, meanwhile, made his way to the Führer bunker, where he arrived around midnight. And when he was taken to see General Krebs, Krebs admitted his amazement that Krukenberg had even managed to make it to Berlin. He told him how over the last 48 hours, large numbers of officers and units had been ordered to Berlin, but that many had failed to show up. "You're the only one who's made it," he said. The embarrassing truth was that Krukenberg's French fascists represented the only real quality reinforcements Berlin had received in days. However, as welcome as Krukenberg's men were, they were not going to swing the tide of the battle. And so morale in the Führer bunker was fading fast, and the impending defeat caused most people to contemplate whether it was best to commit suicide by gun or by cyanide. It was assumed that nobody would leave the bunker alive, and the inhabitants decided to hide from reality by increasingly turning to schnapps to get them through the day. Despite the rising levels of intoxication in the bunker, the daily war conference took place as usual. But by now, the deteriorating Berlin defense picture was quickly turning such conferences into pointless exercises, especially as the complete breakdown in communication with the frontline troops prevented Hitler's generals in the bunker from getting an accurate assessment of the battlefield. In desperation, aides were forced to ring civilian apartments around the periphery of the city. If the people answered, they were then asked if they had seen any signs of Russian troops. If a Russian voice replied, usually with a string of colourful swear words, then that told the Germans all they needed to know.